February 1969. While America was focused on a war overseas, something impossible was happening in silence. A man few outside Harlem truly understood was moving through systems no criminal had ever touched. Frank Lucas wasn't surrounded by gunmen. He wasn't fighting rival crews in alleyways. He wasn't even visible. The cargo moved first, sealed, respected, untouchable, military flights, flag-draped coffins, no inspections, no questions. At the same time, heroin purity across the United States spiked overnight. Entire neighborhoods changed in weeks. Old crime families panicked. Federal agencies couldn't explain it. And inside Washington, quiet alarms started going off. Lucas was still unknown, still underestimated, still invisible. But the system had been breached. Someone had found a way to move drugs through the most sacred pipeline in America, one protected by war, protocol, and silence. And if it was real, it wasn't just a crime, it was a national failure. This is the story of how one man exploited a blind spot no one dared to look at, and why what investigators eventually uncovered terrified more than just the streets. Before we continue with the video, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. In the early hours of 1969, while America was still half asleep under the weight of a distant war, a quiet operation moved without sirens, without headlines, without resistance. Cargo manifests were stamped, uniforms were folded, coffins, flag-draped, sealed, unquestioned, were loaded onto military transport planes returning from Southeast Asia. No customs inspections, no searches, no hesitation. Inside some of those coffins, beneath the bodies of fallen soldiers or in containers designed to look identical, was something that would soon flood the streets of New York with devastating precision, nearly pure heroin. At the center of that operation stood Frank Lucas, a man who had already learned a dangerous truth about America. Power didn't always come from violence. Sometimes it came from understanding the system better than the people who built it. Lucas had grown up watching Harlem from the shadows, absorbing lessons most men ignored. He learned who asked questions and who didn't. He learned what was sacred, what was rushed, and what was protected by silence. By the late 1960s, as the Vietnam War escalated, Lucas saw an opening no cartel, no mafia family, and no street crew had dared to exploit. The war had created a logistical miracle. Thousands of American troops were rotating in and out of Vietnam. Equipment, supplies, and bodies were moving across the Pacific at industrial speed. The military pipeline was sacred, it was fast, and above all, it was trusted. That trust would become his weapon. Heroin was already destroying neighborhoods, but the supply chain was inefficient. Middlemen diluted it, prices fluctuated, quality was inconsistent. Lucas wanted something different. Control from source to street. He wanted heroin so pure it could dominate the market without a single bullet fired. So he went to the source. In Southeast Asia, particularly in regions of Laos and Vietnam, opium production thrived amid chaos. Warlords controlled poppy fields. Corruption was routine. Cash spoke louder than ideology. Lucas didn't arrive waving flags or threats. He arrived with discipline, cash, and a promise: direct access to the American market without interference. What made his operation extraordinary wasn't just its ambition, it was its audacity. Military coffins were rarely inspected. The idea of desecrating a fallen soldier was unthinkable. Regulations were built on respect and urgency. Bodies had to come home quickly. Families were waiting. Officers signed off. Planes took off. Lucas understood that no one wanted to be the man who delayed a coffin. By late 1969, shipments were moving regularly. Heroin arrived at American bases, transferred into coffins designed or modified for concealment, and flown back to the United States. From there, the cargo was quietly extracted and routed into Harlem, Detroit, Washington, D.C., and beyond. On the streets, the product became known by a name that spread like a whisper: Blue Magic. It was nearly 98% pure. Addicts noticed immediately. Dealers noticed faster. A smaller dose hit harder. Word traveled block by block. Lucas undercut competitors not by lowering quality, but by overwhelming them with it. Established crime families were blindsided. The Italian mafia, which had dominated heroin distribution for decades, suddenly faced a supply they couldn't match or control. Violence followed, but Lucas rarely appeared near it. He dressed conservatively. He avoided attention. He lived by one rule: never looked like money. While street-level chaos increased, federal authorities struggled to understand what had changed. Overdoses spiked. Seizures didn't explain the volume. Informants talked, but their stories sounded impossible. Coffins? Military flights? It sounded like myth, but patterns don't lie forever. By the early 1970s, whispers reached Washington, not through newspapers, but through internal briefings. Analysts noticed that heroin purity had jumped nationwide at the same time. Ports weren't compromised. Borders weren't breached. Someone had found a route that bypassed traditional enforcement entirely. That route embarrassed everyone who touched it. The Drug Enforcement Administration, newly empowered and under pressure, began connecting dots no one wanted connected. Military logistics, overseas bases, unusual flight records, financial anomalies tied to Harlem that didn't align with known syndicates. And hovering over all of it was a single name. Still obscure to the public, but increasingly alarming to federal eyes. Frank Lucas wasn't just moving drugs. He was exposing a flaw in the American system so severe that acknowledging it meant admitting the unthinkable, that the machinery of war had been used against its own people. Inside the White House, the concern wasn't only about heroin, it was about perception. If the truth surfaced, trust in military transport, in casualty protocols, and in wartime operations would fracture. This wasn't a crime story anymore. It was a national vulnerability. Yet on the streets of Harlem, Lucas was already a ghost with influence. He paid his drivers well. He cut out intermediaries. He demanded discipline. Anyone who drew attention was removed. Anyone who talked disappeared. And while agents struggled to gather proof, coffins kept flying. Each arrival was silent, each landing unquestioned, each shipment another step closer to a reckoning no one was prepared for. Because when the DEA finally opened the right door, when they finally looked where no one wanted to look, they wouldn't just find heroin, they would find evidence that shook the foundation of American authority itself. And that discovery was still coming. By 1970, Harlem was changing in ways that didn't announce themselves with gunshots or headlines. The shift was quieter, more dangerous. Corners that once sold weak, unreliable heroin were now flooded with something different, something cleaner, stronger, and terrifyingly consistent. The name Blue Magic moved faster than the product itself. Dealers didn't advertise it. They didn't need to. Addicts felt it instantly. A fraction of the usual dose delivered a deeper high, a longer escape. Word traveled through whispers, through hospital corridors, through bodies found too still in apartments that smelled of burnt spoons and sweat. At the center of this transformation was Frank Lucas, but he remained invisible by design. Unlike the flamboyant kings of organized crime, Lucas avoided spectacle. No flashy cars parked on corners, no loud entourages, no nightclub photos. He understood something most criminals ignored. Visibility invited curiosity, and curiosity invited federal attention. Instead, Lucas built a corporate structure disguised as a street operation. He recruited drivers from his hometown in North Carolina, men he had known since childhood, men with no criminal records, men who trusted him more than they feared prison. He paid them salaries, not percentages. Loyalty replaced greed. Discipline replaced chaos. Each level of the operation knew only what it needed to know. Street dealers didn't know where the heroin came from. Couriers didn't know who financed it. And almost no one ever saw Lucas in person. This insulation was intentional. While other crews fought over territory, Lucas focused on supply. He had learned long ago that whoever controlled the source controlled everything downstream. Violence was bad for business. It attracted police. It disrupted distribution. It created witnesses. So Lucas did something radical for the time. He undercut the mafia. Italian crime families had dominated heroin for decades, relying on European connections and layered distribution networks. Their product was diluted repeatedly to maximize profit. Lucas flipped the equation. He sold nearly pure heroin at prices lower than diluted competition. Dealers defected overnight. What the mafia couldn't tolerate wasn't the loss of money, it was the loss of control. Meetings were held. Names were discussed. But every lead ended in the same place: confusion. No one could identify how Lucas was sourcing his supply. No ports were compromised. No known labs were involved. Informants produced rumors that sounded insane. Military coffins, Vietnam, bodies. Most dismissed it as street mythology, but the consequences were real. Overdose rates spiked across New York, New Jersey, and Washington, D.C. Emergency rooms filled. Police departments noticed a paradox. Arrests were up, but seizures didn't explain the volume flooding the streets. Something was bypassing the traditional choke points. Inside federal agencies, analysts began to worry, not just about drugs, but about precedent. If heroin could move undetected through protected systems, what else could? The Drug Enforcement Administration, still a relatively young institution, was under immense pressure. President Nixon had declared drugs public enemy number one. Results were demanded. Failures were unacceptable. Yet every task force report led to dead ends. Lucas wasn't laundering money through obvious fronts. He didn't rely on banks. Cash was moved physically, often hidden in plain sight. Properties were purchased through intermediaries. Vehicles were registered under names with no criminal flags. Even his personal habits were calculated. He lived modestly. He avoided drugs himself. He rarely drank. He believed addiction was weakness, and weakness was liability. On the streets, however, his product was creating devastation. Families collapsed quietly. Entire apartment buildings became ecosystems of dependency. Blue Magic didn't just addict, it replaced everything else. Other dealers couldn't compete, so they disappeared or submitted. Lucas became the silent monopoly of heroin east of the Mississippi. And still, he didn't celebrate. Because Lucas understood something deeper than money, power was temporary. Every system eventually noticed disruption. Every anomaly triggered scrutiny. The question wasn't if the government would react, it was how. By late 1970, surveillance increased in Harlem. Unmarked cars appeared more frequently. Wiretaps were requested. Informants were paid more aggressively. Someone inside the operation talked, but not enough. What saved Lucas wasn't luck, it was compartmentalization. When arrests happened, they hit the bottom layers. Street dealers, runners, small distributors. None could testify to anything beyond their immediate contact. There was no paper trail pointing upward, no phone calls to trace, no photographs to circulate. The DEA began to suspect they weren't dealing with a traditional criminal organization. They were dealing with something closer to a private logistics network, and that realization frightened them, because dismantling such a structure required proof, not rumors, and the proof, if it existed, was tied to institutions no agency wanted to accuse publicly: the U.S. military, overseas bases, and wartime transport protocols. Inside Washington, discussions became delicate. The fear wasn't only about heroin, it was about scandal, about congressional hearings, about headlines suggesting that American soldiers had been used, knowingly or not, as part of a narcotics pipeline. For now, silence was easier, and Lucas thrived in that silence. But the streets were getting louder, bodies were piling up, and pressure, political, social, moral, was building toward a breaking point. Someone would eventually look where they weren't supposed to look. And when that happened, Blue Magic would stop being a whisper. It would become an accusation. By 1971, federal investigators had a problem they couldn't write into a report. They knew something was wrong. They knew the heroin flooding American cities was unlike anything they had seen. And they knew the name Frank Lucas, but knowing a name wasn't the same as proving a crime. Lucas had mastered the most dangerous skill in America. He knew how to look invisible. While other traffickers bought mansions, luxury cars, and nightclub tables guarded by armed men, Lucas did the opposite. He dressed like a city clerk, cheap suits, plain shoes, no jewelry. He drove modest cars and avoided places where cameras flashed. To neighbors, he looked like a man who left early for work and came home on time. That wasn't an accident, it was strategy. Lucas believed that law enforcement didn't hunt criminals, it hunted patterns, sudden wealth, loud behavior, predictable habits. Remove the pattern, and you remove the target. Inside Harlem, rumors about him grew, but no one could describe him clearly. Some said he was tall, others said short. Some swore he never left the neighborhood, others said he traveled constantly. The mythology protected him better than guards ever could. Behind the scenes, however, the operation was expanding. The Vietnam War was still raging. Military flights continued at a relentless pace. The Coffin pipeline, whether exaggerated or precisely engineered, remained untouched. No inspector wanted responsibility for delaying the return of a fallen soldier. No officer wanted to be the one who broke protocol and opened a sealed casket. That hesitation was the gap Lucas exploited, but the federal government was beginning to close in, not through force, but through patience. The Drug Enforcement Administration shifted tactics. Instead of chasing drugs, they chased money. Instead of raids, they built timelines. Instead of street arrests, they watched who never seemed to get arrested. And Lucas was always just outside the frame. Surveillance teams followed his associates. They logged license plates. They tracked patterns in real estate purchases, even when those purchases were made under other names. Slowly, a shape emerged. Not enough for an arrest, but enough to justify something more aggressive. Internal memos began to circulate suggesting that Lucas wasn't a typical trafficker. Analysts described him as organizationally sophisticated and structurally insulated. One report compared his methods to corporate supply chains rather than criminal rings. That language made senior officials uncomfortable, because if Lucas was operating the way investigators suspected, then dismantling his network wouldn't just require arrests, it would require exposing how deeply he had penetrated systems meant to be untouchable. Meanwhile, Lucas made a mistake. It didn't involve drugs. It didn't involve violence. It involved pride. In January 1971, Lucas attended the Muhammad Ali-Joe Frazier fight at Madison Square Garden, the fight of the century. It was the most photographed sporting event in America. Celebrities filled the front rows. Politicians, actors, musicians, and mob bosses all wanted to be seen. Lucas arrived wearing an expensive fur coat. He didn't realize it at the time, but that single decision did what years of investigations could not. Across the aisle sat known mafia figures, men federal agents had spent decades watching, and suddenly, next to them, sat a man no one recognized, dressed better than they were. Photographs captured the moment. When those images crossed analysts' desks, alarms went off. Who was this man? Why was he seated among the highest-ranking organized crime figures in the country? And why had no one flagged him before? Within weeks, Lucas went from rumor to person of interest. Surveillance intensified. Wiretaps were approved. Informants were pressured harder. Agents followed him not to catch him in a crime, but to understand how he lived without one. What they found confused them. Lucas didn't meet with suppliers. He didn't handle drugs. He didn't carry large sums of cash. He didn't use coded phone calls. Instead, others moved around him like planets around a sun that never spoke. This forced the DEA into a dangerous realization. The case against Lucas would not be built from seizures or street arrests. It would be built from betrayal, and betrayal required leverage. By mid-1971, arrests within Lucas's network became more targeted. Not random sweeps, precision strikes. Men with families, men with clean records, men who had something to lose. Some stayed silent, others didn't. At the same time, political pressure escalated. The White House demanded progress in the war on drugs. Newspapers questioned why heroin deaths were rising despite increased enforcement. Congressional staffers began asking uncomfortable questions about military logistics. Behind closed doors, officials feared what would happen if the Coffin allegations were ever proven publicly. It wasn't just about drugs. It was about trust in the armed forces during an ongoing war. So the investigation moved quietly, painfully slowly. Lucas sensed the shift before it became visible. He reduced his movements. He delegated more. He trusted fewer people. He understood that the system he had exploited was starting to look back. But by then, it was too late to disappear. The man who had made himself invisible had finally been seen. And once the government saw him, it wouldn't stop until it understood exactly how a single man had turned America's most sacred wartime procedures into the most efficient heroin pipeline in its history. The next phase wouldn't be subtle, it would be surgical. By 1972, the investigation had stopped chasing ghosts and started drawing blood. What changed wasn't the intelligence, it was the strategy. The Drug Enforcement Administration finally accepted a hard truth. They would never catch Frank Lucas with drugs in his hands. He had engineered himself out of the picture. No fingerprints on packages, no recorded orders, no meetings that could be photographed. He had turned leadership into absence, so the government stopped looking at the top. They went after the joints. Couriers were pulled over for minor traffic violations that somehow turned into federal interviews. Accountants were audited. Landlords were questioned. Mechanics were asked why certain cars came in weekly and left cleaner than they arrived. One by one, the invisible network began to feel pressure in places it had never felt it before. And pressure changes behavior. Men who had been calm for years began making mistakes. Routes shifted too often. Payments were delayed. A driver skipped a delivery and didn't call. Another asked questions he was never supposed to ask. The system that thrived on silence began to hum with anxiety. Federal agents noticed the noise immediately. They built charts, names, dates, locations, pinning them to walls in windowless rooms. Patterns emerged. The same faces appeared near different transactions. The same vehicles passed through different neighborhoods on different days. Nothing illegal by itself. Everything suspicious together. Still, there was a missing link. Vietnam. Every lead pointed overseas, but none crossed the line. Military records were sealed, transport logs were protected, jurisdiction ended where uniform began. No agency wanted to accuse the armed forces without irrefutable proof. Then came the break. A former serviceman, low rank, recently discharged, was picked up on unrelated charges. During questioning, an agent asked a question he wasn't supposed to ask, almost casually. "Did you ever see anything strange on the return flights?" The man hesitated. That hesitation lasted long enough. What followed wasn't a confession, it was a correction. He didn't confirm bodies were used. He didn't say drugs were hidden with soldiers. What he said was simpler and more dangerous. Coffins weren't always coffins. Some were empty, some were sealed too perfectly, some arrived heavier than expected, and no one checked. That statement changed everything. The DEA couldn't act on rumor, but they could re-examine procedures, quietly, without announcements, without accusing anyone publicly. Inspections increased, not of coffins, but of paperwork, weight discrepancies, timing irregularities, flight manifests that didn't align with base activity. The cracks were small, but they existed. At the same time, Lucas's inner circle began to fracture. A trusted lieutenant was arrested in New Jersey. He didn't talk at first. Then prosecutors showed him photographs, phone logs, property deeds, not evidence of drugs, evidence of a life he hadn't earned on paper. They didn't threaten him with prison. They threatened him with erasure. Within weeks, cooperation began. Carefully, incrementally, names without context, dates without details, but enough to place Lucas at the center of decisions he never physically executed. For the first time, prosecutors felt they had a shape they could present to a judge. Wiretaps expanded. Search warrants multiplied. Surveillance became constant. Lucas noticed. He changed routines again. He stopped trusting intermediaries. He delayed shipments. He rerouted money. He even considered shutting the pipeline temporarily. But shutting down meant admitting vulnerability, and vulnerability invited collapse. So he kept moving. Then came the moment that removed any doubt that the government would finish what it started. A coordinated raid, multiple locations, same hour, hit Lucas's financial infrastructure, safe houses, storage units, properties registered under distant relatives. What agents found wasn't heroin, it was cash. Millions of dollars in neatly bundled bills, serial numbers intact, no laundering, no attempt to disguise the volume. It wasn't sloppiness, it was confidence, the belief that no one would ever look there. That belief was gone. Within days, the case reached federal leadership. Briefings moved beyond the DEA. The implications were now too big, too sensitive, too close to national institutions. What had started as a drug investigation was now a matter of state embarrassment, because proving Lucas's operation meant proving that America's wartime logistics had been compromised, systematically, repeatedly, and quietly, and someone, somewhere, had looked the other way. As warrants were signed and arrests prepared, Lucas remained outwardly calm. He had built his empire on the idea that systems failed before men did. Now the system was waking up, and when it finally moved, it wouldn't miss. The next knock on his door wouldn't be discreet, it would be final. The arrest didn't come with drama. No sirens screaming through Harlem, no helicopters, no press waiting outside. It came early, controlled, almost respectful, because by then the government wasn't just arresting a drug trafficker. They were closing a chapter they hoped would never be fully read. In January 1975, federal agents moved on Frank Lucas with warrants that had taken years to assemble. Financial crimes, narcotics conspiracy, racketeering, charges designed not to shock the public, but to survive court. When agents entered his properties, they found exactly what they expected and what terrified them: cash, weapons, records, but still, no heroin. That absence was almost insulting. After everything, the surveillance, the informants, the political tension, Lucas had left no physical trail of drugs behind him. It confirmed what investigators already feared. This man had run one of the largest heroin operations in American history without ever touching the product himself. The real shock came in the days that followed. As evidence was cataloged and interviews began, Lucas did something no one anticipated. He talked, not immediately, not recklessly, but deliberately. Lucas understood leverage better than most prosecutors ever would. He knew that the government's greatest fear wasn't losing the case. It was what the case might reveal if it went too far. So he offered cooperation. Names, routes, methods, corruption. What he described behind closed doors made agents go silent. Lucas didn't paint himself as a street criminal. He described himself as a businessman operating within loopholes created by war, bureaucracy, and willful blindness. He explained how the pipeline worked, not as a rumor, but as a logistical reality. how weight tolerances were exploited, how paperwork replaced inspections, how sacred processes became shields. He named military contractors. He named facilitators. He named people no one expected to hear mentioned in a drug case. And that's when the tone changed. Prosecutors realized they weren't holding a man who feared prison. They were holding a man who understood embarrassment, national embarrassment, institutional embarrassment. The Drug Enforcement Administration had spent years trying to prove Lucas was powerful. Now they were trying to contain how powerful his knowledge actually was. Meetings multiplied. Phone calls were made. Certain lines of questioning quietly stopped. Lucas was not offered freedom, but he was offered something unusual: protection. Because if his testimony ever became public in full, it wouldn't just expose a drug empire. It would expose how easily American systems, military, legal, political, could be bent without breaking. In court, the story presented was narrower, safer, focused on money, drugs, and conspiracy. The Coffin allegations remained implied, never fully argued, never fully denied. Enough truth to convict, not enough to destabilize. Lucas was sentenced to decades in prison. On paper, justice had been served, but inside law enforcement, the case was quietly labeled something else: contained. Contained scandal, contained damage, contained truth. Inside prison, Lucas remained calm. He cooperated selectively. His information led to dozens of arrests. Major arrests, corrupt officials, rival traffickers. Entire distribution chains collapsed. At one point, he was considered one of the most valuable informants the federal government had ever held. That status came at a cost. Lucas was stabbed in prison. He was isolated. He was moved repeatedly. Protection had limits. Yet even behind bars, his legend grew. Other inmates didn't see a fallen king. They saw a man who had beaten the system so thoroughly that the system had been forced to negotiate with him. Years later, as sentences were reduced and time passed, a quieter question lingered among those who had worked the case. How much of the truth never made it into the record? Files were sealed, testimonies redacted, certain names never spoken publicly, because acknowledging the full scope of Lucas's operation would mean admitting something no government wanted to admit during a war already bleeding public trust: that the machinery designed to honor the dead had been used, even briefly, to poison the living. When Lucas eventually walked free, decades later, he didn't celebrate. He didn't claim victory. He didn't write manifestos. He simply existed. The man who had once moved heroin with military efficiency now moved unnoticed through a world that only knew fragments of his story. But the damage had already been done. Entire neighborhoods never recovered. Entire families never healed. And an entire generation paid the price for a system that looked away at the wrong moment. The question that remained wasn't whether Frank Lucas had been stopped. It was whether the system that allowed him to exist had ever truly been fixed. When Frank Lucas left prison, America had already moved on. The Vietnam War was history. Nixon was gone. New drugs, new enemies, and new crises had replaced the quiet terror of heroin flooding inner cities. To the public, Lucas was a name from another era, half-remembered, simplified, reduced to headlines and rumors. Inside government offices, however, his case never truly closed. Files remained sealed. Testimony stayed redacted. Briefings referenced logistical exploitation without specifying how deep it had gone. The official record told a clean story: a powerful trafficker, dismantled through cooperation and prosecution. The unofficial record told something else. Within the Drug Enforcement Administration, Lucas's case became a reference point, a warning more than a victory. Training materials emphasized compartmentalization, not because Lucas invented it, but because he proved how dangerous it could be when criminals mastered it better than institutions. What haunted investigators wasn't how much heroin Lucas moved. It was how little resistance he encountered. Military transport procedures were revised quietly. Weight tolerances tightened. Oversight expanded. Coffin handling protocols were altered, not announced, not explained, simply changed. No press releases, no congressional spectacles, just adjustments that suggested someone, somewhere, had learned the wrong lesson the hard way. At the White House, the fear had never been about one man. It had been about credibility. During an era when public trust was already collapsing, confirming that wartime systems had been exploited for narcotics would have done irreversible damage. So the truth was managed, not erased, not denied, managed. Lucas himself rarely spoke publicly about the details. When asked, he stayed vague. Sometimes he denied parts. Sometimes he let others exaggerate them. The ambiguity served him. It kept the story alive without forcing anyone to confirm it. For the neighborhoods he had once controlled, ambiguity offered no comfort. Harlem bore the scars long after the money vanished. Addiction had reshaped families. Trust had eroded. A generation grew up navigating consequences without ever seeing the architecture that caused them. No hearings addressed that damage. No commissions measured that cost. History moved forward. Years later, journalists revisited the story. Filmmakers dramatized it. Books debated what was real and what was legend. The coffin narrative became the most contested piece. Half proven, half denied, fully unsettling. And that was the point. Because the most effective crimes don't just break laws, they expose weaknesses. Lucas exposed how reverence could replace verification, how urgency could override oversight, how silence could protect more than truth. By the time America realized what had happened, the system had already adjusted, not to admit fault, but to ensure it never had to face the same question again. When Frank Lucas died, obituaries called him a kingpin, an informant, a criminal mastermind. Few mentioned the deeper implication of his life's work, that the most secure systems are only secure until someone understands them better than their creators. The coffins no longer carried secrets. The flights no longer moved unchecked. The pipeline was gone. But the lesson remained. Sometimes the most dangerous threats don't come from outside enemies. They come from inside the rules, quietly, patiently, waiting for the moment no one thinks to look.